Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Sweet Taste of Liberty, a true story of slavery and restitution in America, by W. Caleb Mcdaniel, narrated by Paul Heitsch. She saw her life like a great tree in leaf, with the things suffered, things enjoyed, things done and undone. Dawn and doom was in the branches. Zora Neale Hurston. Their eyes were watching God. Prologue. Zebulon Ward of Arkansas liked to say that he was the last American ever to pay for a slave. It would have been a doubtful honor even if it were true, as one newspaper said about Ward in 1887. Ward's story, however, was dubious itself, and the true story brought him no honor at all. 8 years before the Civil War began, he kidnapped a free woman and sold her as a slave. After the war, she had sued him for an enormous amount of money, arguing that she deserved reparations for her enslavement. But Ward preferred to tell his own version of the facts, making himself out to be the last slave buyer. Many who heard his story would never learn the truth. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a cropped gray beard, Ward was well known by the 1880s as a man with a knack for spinning yarns, perhaps the most unique raconteur south of the Mason and Dixon. Some said he looked like Ulysses S. Grant and had even impersonated the ex-president at a party both men attended. True or not, that was the kind of story he loved to tell, and Ward's stories often made their way into the press. Portions of his history are like a romance, wrote one reporter in 1888. By then, Ward was one of the richest men in the South, having made his fortune leasing state prisons in the region. He claimed to have served in 2 wars, and some called him Colonel. He may have been most famous, though, as a horse racing enthusiast, a man of the turf. Before settling in Arkansas, Zeb Ward had raised thoroughbreds in his native state, Kentucky, and at one race, held in 1863, his horse had been the only one to hear the starter signal. The filly won while the other horses stayed at the starting line. Delighted by his luck, Zeb had pocketed the stakes, along with another anecdote for his repertoire. He found a perfect stage for his stories in 1887, during a long stay at New York's St. James Hotel. Located on Broadway and 26th Street, the hotel had a popular bar for actors, socialites, and turfmen such as E. Barry Wall, the dandyish King of the Dudes, who claimed to have introduced the cocktail and the tuxedo to Americans. As a raconteur himself, Ward felt right at home, and reporters found him at the hotel in a reminiscent mood. Most evenings, admirers crowded around to hear his stories, told with an old-school eloquence that drew listeners in. And no story impressed them more than the one about how he allegedly became the last man in this country to pay for a Negro slave. The story was brief, according to Ward, and it had the feel of an anecdote he must have told before. This time, though, a reporter in the audience wrote it down. Colonel Zeb Ward of Little Rock, Arkansas, who has been warden of 3 state penitentiaries, declares that he was the last man to pay for a Negro slave in this country, and that was the result of a suit brought against him a few years ago by a woman slave whom he wished to set free, but who remained with him during a long dispute in the courts regarding her ownership. She sued for remuneration for 6 years' service after the Emancipation Act and gained a verdict. Colonel Ward says that in making out the draft for the amount found, he worded it, "To pay for the last Negro that will ever be paid for in this country." That account soon traveled far beyond New York. Within days it had been reprinted in cities across the country: Cleveland, Chicago, New Orleans, San Francisco. Then the story kept spreading, even though it was mostly false. At least one person could have corrected the record, however, the woman who remained nameless in Ward's popular account. Unbeknownst to him, she was living in Chicago in 1887, along with a son who had just begun attending law school there. And had anyone told her what Ward said in New York, she would have told them a very different story. Her name was Henrietta Wood. Her story began in Kentucky. She was born there, enslaved by a man named Towsey, and then sold twice in her youth before being taken to New Orleans. Eventually, she was brought north to Cincinnati, Ohio, where Wood's mistress at the time declared that she was free. That happened in April of 1848. But in 1853, as she was settling into freedom, Wood was kidnapped in a carriage, taken back to Kentucky, and re-enslaved by a stranger, Zebulon Ward. Ward sold Wood to a slave trader who took her to Mississippi, and a cotton planter who bought her there later moved her to Texas, facts that Ward did not mention in his story at the St. James. Far from wishing to free her, he had captured and sold a woman who was already free. He thereby doomed her not to 6 years' service as his version had it, but to more than a decade of re-enslavement in the Deep South. As a result, Wood's son would be born into slavery too in 1856. Neither of them would be freed until after the Civil War. Even then, freedom proved to be a fragile thing. Twice enslaved and twice freed, Wood knew how easily a doom could follow dawn. Later, as she was looking back upon her eventful life, she would even describe her few years in antebellum Ohio as a sweet taste of liberty, as if freedom could only be sampled in sips. By 1869, a few years after she had tasted liberty again, Wood only had about $25 to her name, but she used that money to return from the South to Cincinnati, the city she had called home 16 years before, and the next year she filed a lawsuit against Ward for what he had done. Her suit demanded $20,000 in damages and lost wages. The case was ultimately heard by a federal court in Ohio, showing just how much had changed because of the Civil War. Before the war, a Supreme Court Chief Justice had famously declared that people of African descent could not be citizens or file suit in a federal court. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, adopted in 1868, rejected that view and extended national citizenship to former slaves such as Wood. Then, in 1878, after almost a decade of litigation, in the twilight of Reconstruction, Henrietta Wood won her case against Zebulon Ward. To his great embarrassment and the amazement of all, the amount she won was $2,500, far below what her lawsuit had asked and even lower than what a man like Ward could have paid, but still much more than other former slaves had received. It remains the largest known sum ever awarded by a U.S. court in restitution for slavery. Wood's suit never would have happened, much less ended the way it did, without her determination to tell her own story. She started telling it in the earliest hours after her abduction. She told it to the lawyers who filed her post-war suit, and she also gave long interviews to 2 Ohio reporters, which make it possible even now to piece together her story. One was published in 1879 in the Ripley Bee, a small paper in a town with a long Underground Railroad history. The other appeared 3 years earlier in the Cincinnati Commercial, thanks to a staff reporter named Lafcadio Hearn. The encounter with Hearn was especially fortunate and fateful. An immigrant born to a Greek mother and a British father, Hearn left Ohio not long after his interview with Wood, eventually moving to Japan and becoming a celebrated writer there under the name Koizumi Yakumo. He got his start as a bohemian and a journalist in Cincinnati, where he earned a reputation, as Hearn himself put it, for writing about the odd, the queer, the strange, the exotic. Hearn's taste for strange tales led him to slaughterhouses and seances, as well as to dingy tan yards and waterfront bars. He was also noted, however, for collecting tales from African Americans living along the river, most of them in a poor neighborhood where few reporters went. That was how he met Wood in 1876. Hearn described Wood to his readers as a powerful woman, probably at least 6 feet in height, tall enough to look Zeb Ward in the eye. One of the stories she related told of the time when Ward's wife tried to whip her. "Guess not," Wood replied. "It takes men to whip me." The power of her memory was what most amazed Hearn, a man with indistinct memories of his own troubled childhood and a distinct interest in stories about American slavery. Before joining the commercial, Hearn had scandalized his white friends by marrying a woman of color, another former slave. Her name was Alethea Foley, also known as Mattie, and although she and Hearn soon split up, she later told another reporter how they met. Foley was working as a cook in the boarding house where Hearn stayed, and he often found his way to the kitchen and spent hours talking to Alethea of the misery of her youth in slavery. Wood also decided to entrust her story to Hearn, a story that made claims about what she was due. Doubtless there are many ex-slaves in this and other cities whose experiences have been not less bitter or less eventful, Hearn said, introducing Story of a Slave in the commercial, but these seldom care to speak of their life before freedom or can remember the incidents of such a life so fully. Hearn concluded with a brief summary of her suit against Ward, noting that she did not forget who had wronged her. Hearn was right. Henrietta Wood did not forget. But her interviews do not contain everything that she remembered. Unlike Ward or Hearn, she could not read or write, and she did not have the kinds of public platforms they enjoyed. She relied on a few white men to put her story to paper, and much was undoubtedly lost in that translation. Although Hearn assured his readers that he presented Wood's story just as it was told, he also admitted to leaving out some parts that he deemed too horrible for publication. He removed some vernacular peculiarities as well. And there were other facts of her life, such as the origins of her surname, that she never shared or he did not record. Minor errors marred the interviews, too. Hearn heard the name of Wood's first owner as Moses Towser. 3 years later, the Bee reporter heard the last name as Tucci. Moses Towsey was the man's actual name. There were also things that Wood herself did not know for certain. "I can't quite tell my age," she told Hearn in 1876, but she guessed that she was about 58 or 59 years old, meaning she was born around 1818. Another record from late in her life put her birth in 1820. She told Hearn she was about 14 the first time she was sold, and that was in 1834, the year Towsey died. Both interviews, nevertheless, contain a wealth of details about Wood's life, many of which can be filled out with other sources, too. And although the restitution that she eventually won was rare, her experiences in slavery were far more representative. If the stories of enslaved women were less well known in the 19th century than stories such as Ward's, the reason had little to do with what women were able or willing to recall. It had more to do with what others at the time were willing to hear. Unlike the story that Ward told at the St. James, neither of Wood's interviews was ever widely reprinted. For decades they were forgotten, except among collectors of the writings of Lafcadio Hearn, all of whom were more interested in him than in her. Although her legal victory was widely reported in 1878 and 1879, the general public had already forgotten Wood a few years later, when Ward trotted his version out for barflies on Broadway. No one knew her on the street. No image of her exists. Ward's story did not even give Wood's name, and no one who published his version supplied it. It is no surprise, then, that she quickly fell into obscurity. Only 2 decades after slavery had ended, most Americans preferred to hear last slave stories, such as Ward's, stories that emphasized progress and expiated guilt by relegating slavery to the nation's fading past. Wood's pursuit of damages argued for a less popular view, that the past might make continuing claims on the present. As the New York Times noted in 1878, when it reported the decision, her victory raised larger questions about slavery's aftermath. Who will recompense the millions of men and women for the years of liberty of which they have been defrauded? Who will make good to the thousands of kidnapped freemen the agony, distress, and bondage of a lifetime? The suit was about more than Henrietta Wood alone. It was about what former slaves were owed for their enslavement, as well as about the real difference that restitution could make. Where had men such as Ward gotten all their wealth? Where, for that matter, had the country gotten its riches? And what could the amount that Wood won do for families like hers? What did freedom mean without restitution for slavery? By 1887, however, such questions did not interest very many white Americans. Most, even in the North, believed that ex-slaves were owed nothing more than emancipation. It had taken a costly civil war to abolish slavery, and even some Americans who supported abolition believed that those who had been freed owed the nation in return. The idea of reparations had few friends and powerful enemies. When a national organization of former slaves arose in the 1890s to advocate reparations, led by a woman named Callie House, it withered under a combination of public indifference and aggressive harassment by federal officials. Meanwhile, white Southerners devised new ways to exploit freed people, such as the convict leasing regimes that Zebulon Ward helped pioneer. When Wood's life ended in 1912, the dream of reparations for slavery, therefore, seemed as unlikely as ever. It seemed no more likely in 1951, when Arthur H. Sims, the son she bore in Mississippi, died at the age of 95, having practiced law in Chicago for more than 50 years. But Sims' life as a lawyer was made possible in part by the money that his mother had managed to win, an amount worth more than $60,000 today. As a woman who had been enslaved only a few years before her suit, she confronted odds that were longer, by far, than any that Ward ever faced. And her victory was not even assured by the time she was interviewed. Her conversation with Hearn took place before the case concluded, and in her last recorded words to the Ripley Bee, Wood said she was still waiting for Ward to pass over them checks. Nonetheless, a check did eventually come, establishing for both Wood and Ward unique places in history. Contrary to what Ward later would claim at the St. James Hotel, he was not the last American to pay for a slave. He was among the very few, and perhaps the very last, to pay a former slave for having enslaved her. The true story, the one that Ward did not want to tell, was that of a black woman who survived enslavement twice and then made a powerful white man pay. Part 1. The Worst Slave of Them All. Chapter 1. The Crossing. The blinds had been drawn and buttoned over all of the carriage windows. In hindsight, that should have been the very first sign of trouble. Still, I never suspected, Henrietta Wood told Lafcadio Hearn more than 2 decades later, after she finally returned to Cincinnati. Otherwise, she might not have left behind in her room the papers that proved she was free. Rebecca Boyd, her employer at the time, was the one who suggested the carriage ride to Covington, Kentucky, on the southern side of the Ohio River. Henrietta, Wood recalled her saying, the memory of that day still vivid in her mind. I want you to come over the river with me. I have some friends to see, and we can get back in time for supper. Before that Sunday, in April 1853, Wood had been working for Boyd for only about 3 months. She cleaned the rooms in the boarding house that Boyd ran on 4th Street in Cincinnati, and every day she wondered whether she would be paid for her work. Boyd's husband, A dentist had an easier time yanking teeth from patients than Wood had pulling a wage from his wife, the worst employer Henrietta had known in the 5 years since she was freed. Boyd kept saying that she would pay, but Wood had not seen a cent. Wood might have believed that Sunday would be different. Another employee later recalled hearing Boyd say she was crossing the river to see about some money she was owed. Maybe she finally intended to settle her accounts. Or maybe Rebecca Boyd made the trip seem like an olive branch. She knew that Wood was a woman used to being on her feet all day. Surely, then, she might enjoy a leisurely carriage ride? A respite from the wood stoves and buckets, the chamber pots and slop jars that had occupied most of her waking hours for the past 20 years. Boyd sent for the hack. Wood got in. The driver steered them west on 4th before turning left and heading south in the slanting afternoon light. Dust swirled in the carriage's wake as it clattered along the cobblestones to the bases of Walnut and Vine, where a swath of unpaved ground sloped down toward the river. There, a steam-powered ferry was waiting to carry them and other passengers across a quarter-mile of water, and the driver directed the curtained carriage right onto its deck. The ferry took only a few minutes to cross the Ohio River. Even then, Wood did not suspect the extent of the danger ahead. In those days, people moved regularly between Cincinnati and Covington, twin cities whose daily commerce required crossing the river. John Gilbert, the black man driving the carriage, returned to Cincinnati later that night, and Wood must have assumed that she would too. But when the carriage drove straight through town and out into the gloaming, she may have begun to fear the truth. She would not be back for supper. The carriage had moved well into the country when the driver finally pulled on his reins. Boyd opened the door and got out to speak with 3 men on the road. Wood told Hearn that she recognized one of them as a man named Frank Rust, whom she had seen at the boarding house. The bumps on his face gave him away. Another she later identified as Willoughby Scott. Wood remembered watching from her seat as one of those men, or perhaps Zebulon Ward, the 3rd man there, walked up to Boyd and shouted in mock anger, "What are you doing with my nigger?" Boyd laughed and joked back with a sarcastic reply, "Oh, she's free." More laughter pealed as Wood saw a roll of cash changing hands in the shadows. Then she heard an order to get out of the hack. The conversation that evening would haunt her for years, enabling her to recount it for Hearn. "Now don't run, or I'll shoot you," one of the men said. "I've got nothing to run for," Wood replied. "She talks mighty big, don't she?" sneered one of the men. Another walked up and fixed her with a stare. "Don't you know me?" he asked. The others laughed again. Boyd returned to her seat alone. Then the driver turned the carriage back toward the river. That night, after the men had forced her to walk into Covington, Wood found herself trapped in a 4th-story room. In her interview with the Ripley Bee in 1879, she remembered that a white man stood guard at her door. Downstairs, she had seen men tying their horses and drinking at a bar. Upstairs, the kidnappers frisked her and rifled through her pockets, failing to find what they wanted. "Where's your papers?" they demanded. She told them. They left. Later, though, one returned to taunt her with more questions. "Don't you want to see Josephine White?" Wood said no, but the name must have struck her like a slap in the face. The sudden, stinging realization that Josephine was behind this. White's mother, Jane Sirode, had helped Ward to secure the freedom papers that the men wished to find. Josephine and her husband Robert had always wanted Jane to sell Henrietta instead. A theory began to form in her mind as the daylight ebbed from her room. A landlady also came to her door with a meal of crackers and tea, but Wood did not feel like eating, so the woman retreated downstairs, muttering under her breath that the whole thing was a shame. "I lay awake all night," Wood later recalled, "and I prayed that the good Lord would stand by me and deliver me out of my trouble." At sunrise, Wood rose and went to the window for one last look at old Cincinnati, where I had had a sweet taste of liberty. She could see the Ohio River below, the water running high. It would be a busy day on the landing. Steamboats were preparing to leave for Pittsburgh, St. Louis, and Louisville, a city she knew well from her days before freedom. A boatload of cotton was arriving from New Orleans, another place she had lived during her first enslavement. Carriages swarmed around the ferry dock, ready to take boarders to houses like those where she had worked for years, most recently Mrs. Boyd's, but also the one on Broadway and Fifth run by a Mrs. Wilcox and, of course, Mrs. Surrodes. Wood recalled spying a fiddler on board a passing lumber raft. Another figure danced. Then a sharp knock on the door brought her back into the room. "God damn you!" shouted the knocker. "Are you never going to get up?" Wood left the room and followed the man down the stairs. There were now only 2 men from the night before, Rust and Scott. They put her into a buggy again, steering it onto the turnpike running south toward Lexington. Soon they arrived in Florence, a tiny crossroads town where travelers often rested after the steep climb from the river. The group checked in for the night at one of the village's roadside inns, and Wood was forced to the floor in the same room as her captors. Wood managed some sleep, but only a little, as she recalled. When dawn came, the men roused her while preparing to leave for a short trip to nearby Burlington, where they planned to collect some slaves they had bought before going on to Lexington. She was to remain locked in their room until they returned. The kidnappers repeated a warning not to talk as they left. "You'd better know nothing about Cincinnati," which meant, as she later put it, "Nigger, I'll whip you if you do." In so many ways, she found herself back where she began. When her captors had gone, Henrietta was left to ponder their next moves, and hers. She had passed her childhood right there in Boone County, Kentucky, not far from Florence and Burlington, though the Covington Turnpike had not been built when she last lived nearby. She had spent no time in Florence, and now she was headed to Lexington, another unfamiliar town. More familiar, though, was what the men likely planned to do. She figured that they would put her with some slaves they were collecting for the southern market, forcing them all onto a steamboat bound for New Orleans or marching them overland in a long line, each person shackled to another. She knew from having been there what awaited in New Orleans, a levee full of markets where human beings were sold. In the end, she would probably be taken to the cotton fields. At that point in her life, Wood had not yet been on the front lines of the cotton states, which by then produced 2/3 of the world's supply of the crop. But she had lived in Louisiana, and she knew that the shores of the Mississippi River were lined with booming plantations. She had seen the cotton bales that were carried on steamboats down the Mississippi and shipped to foreign ports such as Liverpool and Le Havre. Cotton had reorganized the rhythms of national and global markets that stretched far beyond her lines of sight. Long before she ever saw a cotton plant, Wood also knew about the crop's human toll. Most enslaved people who had lived in Kentucky or Virginia did. Nearly 1 million slaves had already been moved against their will from states in the Upper South to the cotton fields of what was then the nation's southwestern frontier. The massive, forced migration resembled a second Middle Passage, ripping apart and scattering countless black families. Hundreds of miles away from the places they were born, slaves who arrived in the Southwest were forced to stoop over plants they had never grown before, pushed to plant and weed and pick from every sunrise to every sunset. Those who were sent built new communities, formed new family ties. They tried to wring what concessions they could from those who wielded the whips and hoarded the region's guns. Some fought back or ran away when they learned they were being sold down the river. Others kept on fighting when they arrived, and still others destroyed themselves in final acts of defiance or grief. At various points on the bottom of the Mississippi were the bodies of those who had jumped overboard and drowned themselves on the way to the cotton states. They picked a death of their choosing, instead of what awaited them there. Henrietta Wood now confronted a similar mix of options.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?